Widow Judy Moran has served the first night of a 26-year jail sentence for the murder of her brother-in-law.
Execution of Des Tuppence Moran, shot by two masked killers at a suburban cafe.
Judy Moran, a name that once struck fear into the heart of Melbourne's criminal world. From gang wars to family feuds, she was at the center of it all. But how did Australia's most notorious crime family go from top of the game to complete chaos? Today, we're diving into the shocking downfall of Judy Moran and the wild ride of the family behind her. The 1980s in Melbourne, gritty, full of tension, and definitely not a place for the faint of heart. But for one family, this city was their playground. At the heart of it all, Judy Moran. Judy wasn't your average housewife. No, she wasn't just hanging out at the grocery store or sipping tea with the neighbours. She was living in the thick of Melbourne's criminal underworld, right alongside her husband Lewis, and their sons, Jason and Mark. This wasn't your usual suburban life, and the Morans weren't exactly your typical family. You see, the Moran family weren't just any criminals, they were the backbone of one of the most powerful and dangerous crime syndicates in the city. At first, it was Lewis who was the face of the operation. He ran everything from illegal gambling to drug trafficking. But soon, the family dynamic shifted. Judy wasn't just the wife sitting in the background. She became an active player in the game, handling the business side of things, making deals, and pulling strings. Judy was tough, no doubt about it. But it wasn't just the cold, hard exterior she wore that made her stand out. It was her ability to survive and thrive in a world where trust was rare and betrayal was constant. She was a mother, a wife, and a criminal mastermind all rolled into one. And let's face it, in a world dominated by men, that took guts. While the Morans were busy building their empire, they were also dealing with constant threats from rival gangs. The competition was fierce. This wasn't just about money, it was about power. And in the dangerous world of organized crime, power was everything. Judy wasn't just a bystander in all of this. She had her own role to play. It wasn't just about keeping the home fires burning. Judy was heavily involved in the family's operations, making sure everything ran smoothly behind the scenes. Some say she was the brains of the operation, while others believe she was just as ruthless as the men around her. Either way, she made sure her family stayed on top, even if it meant dirtying her hands. But as the Moran empire expanded, so did the enemies. The tensions within Melbourne's criminal underworld were bubbling over. It was only a matter of time before the family would face their first major test. By the early 2000s, the Moran family was a well-oiled machine. But, like any empire, it was built on shaky ground, rivalries, betrayal, and constant power struggles. The city's underworld wasn't just about money, it was about control. And the Morans, despite their strength, weren't invincible. Jason Moran, the youngest of the Moran sons, was stepping up. He wasn't just a kid anymore. He was making his mark, getting deeper into the family business. He was already taking on some of the more dangerous jobs, and word around town was that he was becoming a serious player. Some even whispered that he could one day take over from his father, Lewis. But, as we all know, power is a double-edged sword. In 2003, tragedy struck. Jason was gunned down in a brutal attack that shook Melbourne to its core. It was a public execution, the kind of thing you usually only see in movies. But this was real life, and the aftermath was just as messy as you'd imagine. For Judy, it was a gut-wrenching blow. Jason wasn't just her son, he was her right-hand man, the one she thought would carry on the family legacy. His death was devastating, and it left Judy with more than just a grief-stricken heart. It left her with a family in turmoil and an empire on the brink of collapse. The loss of Jason meant the Moran family would have to fight to stay on top. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Despite her grief, Judy wasn't about to sit back and let the family crumble. In fact, some say it was after Jason's death that Judy's grip on the family business grew even stronger. She stepped into the role more than ever, keeping things together when everything seemed to be falling apart. Now, Judy was no stranger to the dangers of the criminal world, but the stakes had never been higher. With Jason gone and her husband Lewis struggling with his own set of problems, it was clear that Judy was now the one holding the reins. The question was, would she be able to keep the family on top? Or would the power struggles and betrayals within the underworld take down everything the Morans had built? In the aftermath of Jason's death, rival gangs saw an opportunity. And you can bet they didn't hesitate. The The pressure on Judy mounted, and the heat in Melbourne's underworld was about to get even hotter. After the shocking loss of Jason, Judy Moran was forced to adapt to an entirely new reality. She had always been tough, but the game had changed. The streets were now even more dangerous, and the enemy wasn't just other gangs. It was time itself. The inevitable legal crackdowns, and the relentless pressure of keeping the family afloat. But no matter how much the world shifted around her, Judy wasn't backing down. While dealing with the fallout of Jason's murder, Judy also found herself tangled up in the legal side of things. Despite her best efforts to stay out of the limelight, her involvement in the family's criminal operations couldn't be ignored. Soon enough, the authorities were closing in, and it wasn't long before Judy found herself in the courtroom. Her first major legal battle came in the mid-2000s, when she was charged in connection with her role in the Gangland underworld. The accusations were serious. She was allegedly involved in everything from drug trafficking to money laundering. For someone who had always prided herself on being tough and untouchable, this was a hard pill to swallow. And yet, Judy wasn't going to go down without a fight. But the courts didn't go easy on her. In 2011, Judy was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The woman who had once ruled the streets of Melbourne now found herself behind bars, facing the consequences of a lifetime spent in the shadows of the criminal world. For many, it was poetic justice. For Judy, it was just another chapter in a life that had been anything but ordinary. Life in prison, however, wasn't exactly what people might have expected. Judy, despite the locked doors and high walls, quickly adapted to her new surroundings. Behind bars, she wasn't some helpless inmate. No, Judy was still calling the shots. She became known as the prison pest, a nickname she earned for her ability to manipulate those around her, even from inside the system. She had a reputation for being a tough customer, and that reputation didn't fade when she entered the prison gates. But even behind bars, Judy's mind was always working. She wasn't just there to serve time. She was planning, calculating, and figuring out her next move. Judy had always been about survival, and now that she was incarcerated, it was no different. Her family, however, was facing even bigger challenges. With Judy locked up, the Moran name was starting to lose its power. Other players in the underworld saw an opportunity to take control, and the family's grip on Melbourne's crime scene was slipping away. Judy Moran spent over a decade behind bars, but even a prison cell couldn't break her spirit. If anything, it seemed to only sharpen her resolve. Throughout her time in prison, she earned a reputation, not just for being tough, but for being the kind of person who could still pull the strings, even from behind the walls. But despite her attempts to keep the Moran family united, the empire she and her husband Lewis had built was crumbling around her. It's no secret that prison life is tough. It's a place where power dynamics constantly shift, where survival is about more than just avoiding fights. It's about holding on to your dignity and your reputation. Judy had both, but what she didn't have was the same control over her family that she once did. While she was locked up, everything outside was changing, faster than anyone could have predicted. The death of her son Jason had already sent shockwaves through the family. But after Judy went to prison, the cracks in the Moran family's power began to widen. Lewis, her husband, was also struggling. In the late 2000s, the once untouchable head of the Moran syndicate was in his own legal battle, and things weren't looking good. As Judy's family faced one crisis after another, she became more and more isolated from the very people she'd fought so hard to protect. Her remaining son, Mark, had always been involved in the family business to some extent, but he wasn't as cutthroat as his late brother Jason. Mark wasn't interested in stepping into the same kind of role in the underworld that his brother had. And this left Judy in a tight spot. She couldn't rely on him to keep the family together in the same way Jason had. While Judy was in prison, Mark's involvement in the criminal world seemed to lessen, and with it, the Moran family's influence. Without the younger Moran sons carrying on the legacy, and with Judy out of the game, the once feared empire began to lose its hold on Melbourne's streets. But it wasn't just her own family that was falling apart. It was the entire underworld network she'd helped build. Melbourne's crime scene had evolved. New players entered the game, gangs shifted alliances, and old rivalries were reignited. One by one, rival crime families started to challenge the Moran's dominance. Without the strong leadership of Judy and her late husband, their territory was slowly being picked apart by enemies. Despite all this, Judy wasn't just sitting idle in prison. She still had a voice. She was still pulling strings from behind bars, though it was clear that the power she had once enjoyed was slipping away. She wasn't in the same position she once had been, and her influence over her family was fading. Her sons had scattered, and her network of associates was growing more fragmented. For Judy, this was more than just a matter of losing her grip on the criminal world. It was about losing control over the only thing that had ever truly mattered to her, her family. In 2014, tragedy struck again. Judy's husband, Louis, was brutally murdered in a targeted hit. The news sent shockwaves through the underworld. To many, it marked the end of an era for the Moran family. Louis had been the driving force behind their empire, and his death was the final blow to their criminal dominance. With Judy in prison, and now without her husband by her side, the once powerful Moran name was being erased from Melbourne's criminal scene. Judy's reaction to Louis's death was one of quiet devastation. There were no public displays of grief or grand statements made. Instead, Judy quietly processed the loss. It was clear she felt the weight of her husband's murder deeply, but she was no longer the same person who had once ruled the underworld with an iron fist. This loss was personal, not just professional. Her life was now one big game of survival, and without Louis, the game was only getting harder. By now, Judy's presence in Melbourne's underworld was nothing more than a shadow of what it once had been. The Moran name was fading, and other criminal empires were rising to take its place. With Judy's incarceration, the demise of her family, and the murder of Louis, the legacy of the Moran crime family seemed like something of the past. Yet, Judy remained a figure of intrigue, her name still whispered in the dark corners of Melbourne's crime world, even though her empire had all but crumbled. But Judy wasn't about to fade quietly into the background. As the years passed, she continued to fight for her place, both in the criminal world and in her family's legacy. She kept in contact with her surviving relatives, tried to offer advice, and clung to any scrap of power she could. Even in the face of everything falling apart, Judy didn't give up. She still held hope that the Moran name could make a comeback, that maybe her family could find its footing once more. But as time went on, it became clear that the world she had once ruled was changing, and not in her favor. The story of the Moran family is a stark reminder of how power can shift in the blink of an eye. One moment, you're on top, ruling over an empire, and the next, you're struggling to hold on to the remnants of what you once had. For Judy, the past was always something she couldn't let go of. But the world outside her prison cell was moving forward, and with every passing year, it became harder to recapture the glory days of the Moran Empire. By the time Judy Moran was released from prison, the world she once knew was long gone. The Moran crime family, once feared and respected, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. While Judy spent her time behind bars, the world outside continued to evolve. New players dominated the underworld. The rise of new crime families and the increased pressure from law enforcement meant that old-school gangs like the Morans no longer had the same influence they once did. Judy might have been tough, but she was also realistic. She knew the game had changed, and it was unlikely that the Moran name would ever return to its former glory. After her release, Judy lived a quieter life, far from the front lines of Melbourne's criminal scene. She kept to herself, only occasionally resurfacing in the headlines, mostly due to her past connections and the intrigue surrounding her life. But with each passing year, it became more apparent that the era of the Moran family was over. In 2021, Judy was once again in the news, not for her criminal activities, but for her health. After a series of personal struggles, including battles with illness, Judy's story became one of faded glory. The tough, feared matriarch of a notorious crime family had grown older, her once razor-sharp grip on the underworld now a distant memory. The world had moved on, and Judy, despite her resilience, couldn't turn back the clock. Despite the fall of the Moran Empire, Judy's story remains a cautionary tale of how quickly the tide can turn. The rise and fall of the Moran family shows how power can slip away when you're no longer in control, and how the very thing that built you up can tear you down. Judy's legacy is complicated. On one hand, she was a formidable woman who played a central role in the criminal empire that terrorized Melbourne for decades. She had the grit, the cunning, and the resolve to do whatever it took to protect her family. But on the other hand, her life was filled with violence, loss, and betrayal. Her empire, built on a foundation of fear, crumbled under the weight of its own greed and instability. In the end, Judy Moran was a product of the world she inhabited, ruthless, determined, but ultimately swept away by forces beyond her control. And while her story may not have ended with a bang, it's a reminder of the fragility of power and the cost of a life lived in the shadows. The Moran family may have once ruled the underworld, but in the end, their legacy was nothing more than a fading chapter in the history of Melbourne's criminal past. Judy Moran, the woman who once held it all together, is now just another name in the long list of forgotten crime figures. Her rise to power was legendary, but her downfall, a slow, painful unraveling, serves as a reminder that no empire lasts forever. So, what's left of the Moran legacy? A family torn apart by loss, betrayal, and the inevitable passing of time. Judy Moran, once the fearsome matriarch, is no longer the force she once was. But the story of her rise and fall serves as a warning, a reminder of how fleeting power can be. In a world built on crime, loyalty, and survival, there are no guarantees. The Moran name may have faded, but the story of Judy and her family remains a chapter in Melbourne's dark history, one that will never be forgotten.